Hello friends, welcome to Homegrown Florida. I'm Patrina. I thought today would be the perfect day for us to get together and work on our spring garden planning. I know it's crazy, spring is right around the corner, and one thing I'm going to be using today is my free ebook. You can get this down in the description. You just have to go to the link, put in your email address, and I will send you an electronic version of this book. Now, I had this book printed for myself so that I could use as we go through this spring planning together. I also have my seeds, my book. I think that's all we're gonna need. Now, I put out this ebook a few months ago, so if you already have a copy, you may want to get an updated version. I have been making a lot of changes based on the suggestions you guys have been making, one of which is probably the one that I noticed the most as I've been going through here updating my book, is that while the color is pretty, it's very difficult to write in. So I did remove a lot of the background colors so that it's easier to write in, as well as I added a bunch of stuff to the ebook, including charts so that you can draw in your garden plan, as well as pages for my favorite varieties. So make sure you get a new copy of this if you have one of the older versions. So we're going to go ahead and flip to about the second page, which is the garden goals. I like to do this because it helps me really feel like I have achieved something, because a lot of the time in the garden you're going to have failures. It does not matter how good of a gardener you are going to have failures. You are going to kill plants. So I always find that if I put goals down or write my goals down for that season and I make them very specific, so it's a SMART goal, a very specific goal, then by the end of the season, I usually feel like I have accomplished something big and I'm not so focused on the things that didn't go so well. So I want to share with you what I have for my goals for this spring season. My first goal here is I want to grow watermelons. So I have grown watermelons before and I have had varied success. Some of them have been good. Some of them have been bad. It hasn't really been consistent, and I really want to go all in and do a lot of watermelons. I think I'm picking 3 of my beds this season to do nothing but watermelons. Additionally, I'm going to be growing a lot more flowers this season. Leading into summer, I find that between the beans and the peas and the sweet potatoes, I also like to pepper in a lot of flowers to really get the pollinators coming to this location. Another one of my goals is I'm going to be doing my organic garlic. So I planted my garlic, and if you haven't seen that video, I'll put it up in the description as well as up here, how I planted them. But my big goal with the garlic is to grow them organically. Last time I did not grow them organically. I had a problem with my soil health and the fertility and all that, so I ended up going with a non-organic fertilizer, and it worked. But I really want to be able to grow them organically. So that's another goal of mine. A third goal, which I'm really excited about, is to put in a Florida native garden in my front yard. So I have a bunch of ornamentals in my front yard that are not native, and I'd like to replace them with all native plants. And then my last goal, which I wrote this before I wrote this early, probably back 2 months ago or something like that, was to add another bed, which has been completed. And once again, I'll put that down in the description if you want to see how to fill a bed super cheap. So we're already off to a great start because I already got one of my goals accomplished. I put in another raised bed. So your goals could be totally different. Like a lot of the times, some of my goals surround being able to grow enough of a certain type of vegetable for a year's supply of food. So for example, during the summer, I will say I want to grow a year's supply of sweet potatoes, and that would be one goal. I really encourage you to be very specific about your goals, because if you just say, I want to grow food as my goal, you're going to struggle with achieving that goal, because like I said, you're always going to have failures in the garden. But if you were very specific and say, I want to grow all of my lettuce for the season, or I want to grow all of my sweet potatoes for the season, then that's a very specific goal. Or maybe you want to expand your garden, or maybe you want to get better at container gardening. These are all really good specific goals instead of just having a broad goal. I'm a stickler. I'm big about goals. I think that they're very, very important. Next up, we are going to skip to the middle of the book, which is the layout of the beds. So I have two types of layouts that you can draw in. One is a kind of a square foot garden plan, and you can use this for beds if you have raised beds, or you can use this as a way of drafting out your in-ground gardening, such as like if you have flower beds on the side of your house, or if you have a designated space, you can use this, and each one of the squares equals 1 square foot. The other thing I added in here were these, and these are my container gardening plans. Now I have green stalk gardens, so this is actually drawn like a green stalk, but if you don't have a green stalk, say you're just using 5-gallon buckets, each one of these levels can be your 1 5-gallon bucket, if that's the way you'd like to do it, or they can be pots or anything that you like that's in a container. They can be vertical containers. They don't have to be green stalks. You can have a regular vertical container that is a different variety, and you can use this layout as a way of drafting out that. So first things first, we are going to get started with the bed layout. So I've pre-filled a lot of this, but I still have more to do. So as you can see here in bed 1, I have lots of watermelons. I have some onions that I already had planted. Over here in bed 3, I also have more watermelons, but I think what I'm going to do is I think I'm going to expand the watermelons into bed 2 as well. So I did have kidney beans and flowers here, but I think I'm going to scratch that, and I'm going to add another patch of watermelons. And the reason why is I had planned on taking this rosemary out. So I have cuttings, and those cuttings are growing very well. So I'm going to take this whole bush out. It's a perennial, and it's kind of just in a weird spot in the middle of my garden. And I usually use these beds for, growing my annuals. And so I'm going to take that rosemary out, and now that gives me this whole space right here to grow my watermelons. Bed 1, 2, and 3 are all going to be watermelons. Then we have, let's see here, bed 4, we have some cucumbers, some corn plants, and then winter squash. I'm probably going to be doing, I think I'm going to do Butter Baby is the variety I want to do on the winter squash. It is a trellising variety, and I like the idea of having the trellis near the corn plants because they can climb up the corn plants, as well as this bed 4, is the bed that I have my actual trellis in. So the cucumbers up front are kind of spindly and thin, so they can grow up and not shade out the corn. And then the winter squash, I'm going to start before the corn so it can get tall and kind of climb up the trellis or climb up the corn plants as they grow. Over here in bed 5, I have my garlic and onions. Those were already in the bed, and I just put down the white potatoes, so that bed is completely filled. Bed 6 over here, I'm doing tomatoes. I'm going to do an entire bed of tomatoes because I have to refill my spaghetti sauce and my salsa. I am on my last jar. So we're going to do tomatoes in this bed, but additionally, I always like to have multiple things going on. So I'm going to do this tomatoes along the line here, but in between them and down here, I think I'm going to do a lot of basil because I'm running out of pesto. So if I grow a bunch of basil along the edge of these tomatoes, one, basil is a great companion plant for tomatoes, and second, it's an understory type plant. So while the tomatoes grow tall, the basil will stay kind of bushy underneath, and I can clip the top off and keep that basil growing bushy. So I think that's what I'm going to do there. And then over here, let's see here, we talked about bed 3 and 4. Let's talk about bed 7. Bed 7 is where I try to keep my perennial peppers, and so I have a bunch of peppers that are on there that I've overwintered, and so I'm going to add some flowers, and then that's probably about it for that bed. I'll probably add more peppers as we move along the season. Probably put a pepper in here, eventually one right here. And then the flowers will just, kind of be peppered in around the peppers. Peppered in around the peppers. That's funny. All right, bed 8. This is actually going to become bed 9 because this is my new bed, bed 9. I'm going to always do bed 9 as my greens. So you can see here I've got lettuce, I've got kale, and I got mustard. And I have a heat wave lettuce. As we move into spring, it's going to start getting a little too hot for lettuce, but I have a good variety, that heat wave lettuce, that is really good for growing in the heat. It won't make it all the way to summer, but it should make it through most of spring, and I'm going to do a section of that. Kale, particularly the dinosaur kale, is really, really good in the heat. It will eventually get, inundated with aphids and bugs and stuff, but until then, I'm going to grow a lot of that kale in here. It has good flavor. And then my Chinese cabbages and mustards, I'm going to grow in this section of that bed. Now, I picked this bed because this bed gets a lot of shade. Probably only about 3 hours of sunlight a day, which doesn't sound like a lot, but for greens in Florida, you can do it. They will grow in very little bit of sun or even dapple shade. It will grow in that. So this is going to be my greens bed. Now I have another bed that I'm going to decide what to do with now that I'm moving my greens from bed 8 to bed 9. I have bed 8 that I've got to figure out what I'm going to do with, and that's probably going to be my experimental bed. I like to have that sometimes, a bed that is just for picking new varieties, and I'm only doing 1 or 2 plants, and I'll put them in a bed just to see how they do. So I might actually dedicate an entire bed to my experiments. So I think that is going to be it for me on the beds. I have 9 beds. I have some in-ground stuff, but that's mostly for perennials. So I'm just going to stick to my annuals in this spring planting. So now that we have gotten that done, we're going to flip to the plant planner. The plant planner is going to be an extension of the plan. So let's keep talking about bed 9 and all of those greens. So for the lettuce, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 square feet that I'm planting for the lettuce. So we're going to do the heat wave lettuce, and I'm going to start planting that probably now. So let me just put a date in there. I have 8 square feet. Let me add that. 8 square feet. And in each square foot, I can probably grow 4 plants if I'm not looking for giant heads. So 4 times 8 means I'm going to do 32 plants. I am going to transplant them. So I'll sow the seed. You can put a date here, or you can do just a check mark. If I already planted it, I just put a check mark. And then I'll probably transplant them probably about 3 weeks later. So let's call that 3-1. I'm not going to direct seed them. You can direct seed lettuce, but I like transplanting them. I think they just do better. I don't know why. The days to germinate should only be about 3 to 5 days for lettuce seeds to germinate, and I'm going to do a spacing of 4 per square foot. So I'm just going to write that down. Now the harvest date for these is if I sow the seed on 2/15, it only takes, 3 to 5 days. Let's call that 2/19 is when it's going to be growing. So 2/19. And then this variety, this heat wave variety that I have, is about a 60 day. So by 4/19, I should have food ready to harvest. And I like to write this down because when you're watching your plants grow every single day, sometimes you think that they're growing slowly, and the easiest way to know if they're not growing slowly is to come and check your harvest date. And is your harvest date getting closer, or is it almost over? Will tell you whether that plant is doing as well as it should be doing at that point. So then we'll just keep marking them down and keep writing off the dates that we're going to plant them and the dates that we think that they're going to be ready for harvest. So this will give you basically a layout of exactly what to plant on every single day. So now we know exactly what we need to plant on which day and how many. So now let's work on our other set of chores. So I have a chore tracker here, and this is actually, I filled it in advance because I know a lot of you have asked like what my schedule is for the garden. So I wanted to show that to you. So my schedule that I do for my chores is every week, as long as I have either a squash or a cucumber in the garden or tomato, I will do my mix of peroxide spray. So it's a 1 to 10 mix of peroxide and water. So the 1 is 1 part peroxide to 10 parts water. And I do that every week on Mondays. For the first and third week of the month, I do my plantings. So I go back to my planting chart and I find the date that's closest to that date, So I generally do these on 2-week time frames anyway. I always pick the same day of the week, which is Tuesday. And on the first and third week of every month, I go to this chart and I figure out which ones are scheduled to be planted, and then I plant those, whether that's in trays or sowing the seeds directly. Now on the second and fourth week on the same day on Tuesday, so the first and third week of the month I do all my seed starting, and on the second and fourth week of the month I transplant. So anything that is ready to go out in the garden, I will transplant it on that Tuesday. Another thing I do on the first and third week of the month is I fertilize, and I do that on Thursday. For week 1, I do a tea, like a compost tea or a fish fertilizer, a liquid one. And on week 3, I generally add my granular, but I only add the granular if the plants look like they need it. I generally don't add it if they are healthy and green and growing properly. I assume that they're getting everything that they need and I don't have to add it. It saves me money in fertilizer. On week 4, on a Friday, I will treat for pickle worms and soft-bodied creatures with spinoside. Now, you don't have to do this. This is something I do, and it's only when I'm growing squash, winter squash to be exact. I don't really do it anymore for cucumbers and summer squash, because usually we eat these up so fast that if you get a little bit of pickle worm, they usually only get 1 or 2, and you can soak them in water and the pickle worms will come out, and then you can just eat the fruit. But winter squash or melons, for example, where they need to live a long time in the garden, the pickle worms will destroy them. So I do cover them with netting and things like that, but they still get through. So I use spinoside on Fridays, usually the 4th week of the month, so only 1 time a month. I do my weeding every Saturday weekly, and I pick a different spot of the garden every week to weed, and that works out good. I can keep up with weeds that way. I rotate my compost on that same day on Saturday. So when I go around weeding, I will stop and I will go and I'll rotate my compost while I'm at it. On week 4, I check my sprinklers. So I have micro sprayers, and sometimes they get clogged with the hard water that we get up there. So on that Sunday, I will just run my sprinklers on the last week of the month and just check to make sure that they're running. Mulch, I put Sunday, but honestly I mulch whenever I have mulch. So if I have grass clippings, they go in. If I need to chip up trees or trip up branches with my Sun Joe Tripper, I will do that on Sundays as well, usually monthly or as needed. And then hand watering, I only hand water my green stalks in my pots, and sometimes my new trees or my young plants. Otherwise, my sprinkler sister handles it. And then so I take this whole chart and I actually put it in my phone as reminders in case I haven't looked at this recently. My reminders will pop up and tell me everything I need to be doing. Eventually you get to a point where this is just a regular schedule and you know it without having to look. So if you were curious what my schedule is, this is my schedule, and it sounds like a lot, but if you split it up, like I said, on Mondays, I will spray my peroxide spray. That's pretty much it. On Tuesdays, depending on the week, I'm either sowing seeds or I'm transplanting my seeds. That's it. And then, Tuesdays I also sometimes will hand water. Because I'm planting seed or transplanting, it makes sense to hand water at that time as well. Then, I don't do anything on Wednesdays. On Thursdays, I will fertilize if it's necessary, and sometimes hand water for those new seedlings or new transplants. So I hit them every other day, usually within that time frame, I don't have to water them anymore. My sprinkler system handles after that. And then I have, you know, some of those things that are done more on a weekly or monthly basis with the spinoside, the weeding, the composting, the checking the sprinkler, and the mulching. And that usually is where I lean on my phone's reminders, because I will forget if it's only once a month. So, helpful hint there. So we talked about our regular chores. Let's talk about our monthly projects. So I have my section here for my monthly tasks, and I have it broken down by the month. If you follow my channel regularly, you will know that I put out a monthly video that I say all the plants that I'm starting, all the projects I'm working on, and my special tip for the month. And lately I've actually been giving out seeds as well. So if you don't watch that, make sure you do within the first week, so that way you can apply for the giveaway. But a lot of my ideas for projects come from my monthly task. So for example, my February task was to start a new bed, which I got done, and then to start spring seeds for the planter, and then also fertilize all my fruit trees. And if you have watched my February video, then you know that the big task, or the big tip for the month, was to focus on your fruit trees and bushes and plants and fertilize them, prune them, do all the things that they need for the year in February. But then all my other months I fill in as I go, as I remember things. But a lot of the times it's like starting seeds, fertilizing the fruit trees, starting fall seeds, winter seeds, doing my big projects. You'll see there's a lot stacked in the January, February time frame, because that's when the weather is cooler. So that's when I do, you know, new perimeters around the trees, new refreshing of the soil in the beds, refreshing the green stock container soils. I'm doing all that stuff that requires a lot of effort and work while it's cool in the garden, rather than waiting till summer to do those things when you're gonna die from the heat. The next thing I have is the fertilizer and watering schedule. So my watering schedule, I use an app on my phone that's connected to my sprinkler system. Another option that you can do if you don't have a sprinkler system set up is to get a timer. So they're really cheap. I'll put some of the ones that I've used over at my mom's garden down in the description, but there is a timer with a sprayer system that you can set it to go off, not necessarily certain days of the week, but you can schedule it for intervals. So every 3 days or every 4 days. That's going to be based on your garden. But for example, my beds, they get it at 2 a.m. on Tuesdays and Fridays. For 30 minutes, 20 or 30 minutes, depends on the time of year. Right now, everything's holding water very well, so I'll do 20 minutes, and as we move into summer, I'll usually bump this up to 3 times a week and do 30 minutes. My green stalks, they get watered with the sprinkler system, except for the very top one, which I get the watering done that same day that the sprinkler systems go off. And then the pots, the same thing. And the fruit trees, I really only water my fruit trees or plants when they're young, and I only water them once a week. So when they're young and they haven't fully established yet, I will water them once a week on Tuesdays. Otherwise, most of the time, if they're established, I stop watering them, and either the rain water them, the sprinklers might water them, you know, or they'll just take groundwater from below, I guess, because I don't water them. Then we talked briefly about the fertilizer. I also document what I fertilize, because later on I might forget how I fertilized something, and based on the way it grew, maybe I realize I might have over fertilized, like with my garlic. They did this thing called brooming, and so I realized I fertilized too often, and I wish I would have wrote down when I fertilized, so that way when I grow it this year I can back that up by about half. I started writing down when I fertilize. And if it is a specific, if I look through the garden and I realize that everything is green except for my peppers are turning a little yellow, for example, that's what happened here in January. My peppers were yellow in bed 7, and so I used Garden Tone fertilizer, granular fertilizer down. And by writing that down, I now know I can keep track of how often I'm fertilizing those peppers, and maybe I need to do something to amend that bed better if I find myself fertilizing it a lot. So once I've done that, the next thing I have in the book, I have not started using this myself yet, But I see myself doing that here shortly once the spring season really kicks off. So what we talked about up to now is really about planning and scheduling. But this is where the fertilizer and this one is where you start getting into the actual execution when you're doing things. We could take all of our chore tracker and document it here for the week. So there should be multiple pages for the weekly worksheet. And you can add all the things that you want to do that week, whether it is, planting something special or going to the nursery and picking up a certain kind of plant that you wanted, or maybe you can plug in the chores that you have here, like planting, transplanting, watering, fertilizing. You can document all that in your weekly worksheet. This is just a great way in case you don't use your phone and have reminders set up that you have a place where you can write that down and follow it every single week. The next thing we have is our plant issue log. So this is kind of similar to the fertilizer tracker in that I can pay attention to how often I'm fertilizing and I can make adjustments, big adjustments, if I have problems. Well, the same thing goes for the plant issue log. So in the plant issue log in January, I started some flowers and they are still not germinated. It's actually right over here. So I feel like I'm having some germination issues. So I did some research and I realized that some flowers really benefit from cold stratification. That means like you got to put them in a very cold environment. So I decided to take some of these exact same seeds. I'm leaving these guys over here to continue to see if they actually do germinate. But I put some seeds in the fridge in a wet paper towel in a plastic baggie, and I set a reminder for myself to check them in 1 month. And then I'll pull those out and I'll plant them, and I'll see if the germination improves by doing that. And by writing this down, I now know that if I have troubles with flower germinations or certain species of flowers, then I know that cold stratification will work. Hopefully, cross our fingers that this actually works. If it doesn't work, that's okay. We'll move on. I'll write down here that cold stratification didn't work and I need to find a new solution for my germination issues. They came from lots of different, providers or seed companies, so I don't think it's a true germination issue. It's definitely something I'm doing wrong at this point. So I'll do more research if the cold stratification stuff doesn't work. Maybe I scratch the seeds or I soak them overnight. There's always lots of things that you can do to try to fix issues. But you're gonna probably get overwhelmed and frustrated if you're not writing it down, so that way you know what you've tried, what works, and what doesn't work. Also could be a time of year thing. Maybe it's still just a little too cold for them. That's another reason why I'm leaving them in the trays for as long as possible, because eventually they should germinate, I think. We'll see. And then the last thing that I fill out is my harvest tracker, which I adore this thing. I love this thing now. This is like my favorite part of the book. I didn't always record my harvest in the way that I do now, and I really love the way that I'm doing it now. Before, what I would do is I would base how well I was doing with the garden based on how much I'm spending at the grocery store or not spending at the grocery store. But that has severely changed with inflation. So it's not necessarily the best measure anymore of how well my garden is doing. And it's very subjective anyway. But by writing down every single thing that I harvest and weighing it, I have a kitchen scale that I can put down in the description if you're interested. By weighing everything and getting the cost of it in the grocery store, I can figure out exactly how much money I am saving from growing my garden. So let's look at a couple examples. On January 1st, I pulled some broccoli off and I pulled 2 pounds. Well, yesterday I pulled 2.5 pounds of more broccoli. So you can do your quantity. So like, for example, bok choy, they don't really sell it by the pound, they sell it by the bunch. So I would put 2 bunches there, but the harvest weight is where most of the other ones come into play. And you can see I've harvested broccoli, strawberries, herbs, and that was like dill, parsley, oregano, cabbage, lettuce, carrots, kohlrabi, and bok choy. And so now that I'm keeping track of this, at the end of my season, I can figure out compare the cost to how much weight that I grew and get an actual total for the month of how much money I'm saving in our grocery bills by growing out there. Now, I don't collect everything. I don't weigh absolutely everything. If I run out to grab some green onions for a dinner that I'm cooking and I'm just cutting enough for that meal, I don't necessarily weigh that. But if I'm doing a decent size harvest of something, I will weigh that if it's not like a one-off type thing. Or if I'm just picking one tomato, I don't necessarily weigh that. So we have our plan in place. We have everything scheduled and ready to go, and that is actually how I am going to plant my garden this season. You saw everything that I'm going to be planting. The next thing that's in the book, I have a few reference items in the book. I do have a list of all my favorite varieties that I've added to the ebook. And then I have the planting charts. So this is the spring planting chart. So based on what season that we're going into, this is the chart that I use to determine when I'm going to plant these seeds. So I'll take this and I'll compare it to the schedule that I've already written, or maybe you could look at this before. That would probably be best, is to look at this before you put your schedule date down and see if they fall within that time frame. Now, if you were starting fall planting, you would flip to the fall planting guide and follow these dates instead. You'll notice that some, I know this has been a little confusing for some folks, there's a lot of things that grow in spring that grow in fall. An example of that is peas. So you can see peas are up here, and I grow them from January through August during my spring garden. But in my fall garden, I grow peas from October to December. Usually in December, they get too cold. Now, mine lived through the frost, at least so far, as long as we don't have something late. But normally they won't. Normally they don't do so good in frost. But mine had lived through all of them, thankfully. But if they hadn't lived through them, I would have picked them back up in January or February and continued planting those peas as part of my spring garden instead of my fall garden. I hope that helps. I'm going to be looking into a way of possibly getting these on all one sheet. I did take a stab at that last night. It's very busy. It's hard to read. I don't think that's necessarily a good way for me to do that just yet. I might have to split it into multiple pages. I'm not 100% sure how I'm going to do it yet. But if that is definitely something that you're interested in and you'd rather it be a one-pager versus, by season, just head down to the comments, leave me a note. If you have other suggestions for the ebook, head down in the comments, leave me a note, and I am happy to make those changes and adjustments if we get enough folks who are interested in that. Because this is really your plan. This is your ebook. This is your garden plan, and I want it to be as helpful as possible so that you can work from this book, print it, keep it electronically, and work from this book in your garden all season long so that you can get better organized and know exactly what you want to grow and what varieties. I hope this was helpful today. Thanks so much for watching. We will see you next time, friend.